Hey guys, how's it going? Walter Hudson here from the Minnesota State Capitol, sitting in my office and wanting to speak to this week's news that a bonding bill passed. 1.5, somewhere between 1.5 and $2 billion worth of borrowing on behalf of the state with your taxpayer dollars in order to fund various capital improvement projects. Now, this is in my short time here, I've only been here a couple of months, the first time that I've really found myself struggling with a decision as to which way I should go. And I want to get into explaining why that is and kind of breaking down the context in which this vote took place and just trying to be as transparent with you as possible. But before I do that, let me just disclose two things. One, I voted no on this bonding bill. Ultimately, I also voted no on the subsequent cash spending capital investment bill. And I had my reasons for that, and I'll go through those. Uh, but the second thing that I want to say is that I think it's a mistake. I think it's a big mistake to assume that for the people in amongst my colleagues in the caucus who voted for this, that because they did so, that they're just categorically not conservative. Because I can tell you firsthand from direct relational experience of talking and working and dealing with these folks every single day that that is 100% not the case. And specifically, I want to speak to this Facebook post that was put forward by former state representative Eric Mortensen yesterday in response to the vote. And he says 21 Republicans joined House Democrats last night and voted for $1.5 billion in new spending. This bonding bill required a supermajority vote, and the Republicans with green dots to the right of their name gave it to them. This means these 21 rhinos prioritize growing government over giving back your surplus or ending taxes on Social Security. With Democrats only having 70 seats and this bill, HF 669, requiring 81 votes, Republicans finally had some leverage, but 21 rhinos pissed that leverage away last night. I've highlighted four of them that should definitely know better by now. With Republicans like this, who needs Democrats? And then, you scroll down, you see the breakdown of who voted yes, who voted no, and four particular representatives highlighted here. Now, I'm going to come back to that because I have a few things to say about Eric Mortensen's post. But before I even get to speaking to any of that, I think there are a couple of things that really need to be said here. First of all, let's take a deep breath. Just, can we go through a little exercise here? Can we just take a deep breath? Because there's so much tension in the room, in the metaphorical room that all of we conservatives and Republicans are standing in. There's so much tension because there has been so much balkanization and so much fighting between factions for so long, for many, many years. I've been involved, if you don't know anything about my background, I've been involved in conservative politics in the state of Minnesota since around about the time my first son was born. He just turned 14 years old. 2009, he was born. I got involved in the Tea Party. Coming out of 2008, coming out of the election of Barack Obama, coming out of bank bailouts. And remember, that was George W. Bush, right? So inherently, the Tea Party movement was in the beginning, an explicitly nonpartisan movement that was focused on the fact that both Republicans and Democrats were engaged in irresponsible policy behavior with little regard for the impact on the taxpayer and little regard for the long-term impact of what it was that they were doing, the bills that they were voting on, the votes that they were taking. And that certainly wasn't the beginning of the schism between the grassroots and what some call the establishment. But it was certainly an inflection point. Things got worse from there. There has been a continual buildup of lack of trust between average everyday citizens, of which I was one at that time, normal everyday activist, couldn't tell you the first thing about Robert's Rules of Order, didn't know anything about how meetings were run or how laws are written or anything above and beyond like the schoolhouse rock. This is how a bill gets passed, basics. Um, it's been a hell of a journey from 2009 to now, many, many years later, when here I am sitting as an elected state representative on the other side of the political transaction, where now I'm actually responsible for public policy. Now I'm actually in the thick of it, doing the work, and seeing how the sausage gets made. And it's ugly. There's no doubt about it. It is not always a good and certainly not always a productive process. We've seen a lot of terrible legislation get passed. And another thing I'll say is that I'm not here today for 1 second, even though I know people are going to say it. I'm not here for 1 second to defend people's votes. I took the vote I took, and I'm happy to defend my vote. Other people took the vote they took, and I'll leave it to them to defend their vote. But what I will say is that this environment, the situation we find ourselves in right now, as conservatives and as Republicans in the state of Minnesota, where we're all suffering collectively under complete Democrat control of the state, that situation is to a large degree the product of the bickering and fighting and back and forth circular firing squad, to use the cliche, that we've been engaged in persistently since my Tea Party days. And I've been guilty of it. We've all been guilty of it. That's another thing. It's not just, I talk to everybody, because there's nobody who I won't talk to within our party, and outside of it as well. And when I'm talking to people who identify as grassroots, who just absolutely deplore the establishment, I hear all kinds of stories about how they've been mistreated by the establishment. Conversely, when I'm talking to folks who've been around the block, and who travel in circles that could not necessarily fairly be characterized as grassroots, I hear the same kind of stories from them about all you people out there, about folks disregarding endorsements, challenging in primaries, running against people in the general election. And hey, Google me, right? Look back in my history. I've done it too. 2016, 2016, I was arguably the most prolific voice in opposition to then nominee Donald Trump before he became president. There's a lot of water under that bridge, a lot of water. I went on to become one of his most enthusiastic, outspoken supporters, in particular after the Brett Kavanaugh episode. And I think his presidency was an essential pivot point for the country and certainly for the Republican Party. So my point is that these tensions are not new. And they are not unique to one side or the other. We all have done this to each other. We've all gone out of bounds. We've all had yellow flags thrown on our team in this intra-party battle between the grassroots and what some may regard as the establishment. But it's got to stop. It's got to stop, because the product of it is what you have here before you, what you see. If this vote upsets you, if this vote for a $2 billion, 1.5, whatever the number is, $1 billion bonding bill, if that upsets you in the context where we have a $17.5 billion surplus or 19, there's all these different numbers. It all depends on how you calculate it. But if it upsets you that vote happened and that money's being borrowed and it's being put on the state's charge card, you're oversimplifying it if you just point to the green dots on the board and say they're the reason that happened, because that is not the entire story. It's not. This vote took place in a context where Republicans are in the minority in both chambers of the legislature. Democrats are in control of the House. Democrats are in control of the Senate. A Democrat sits in the governor's office just a few yards away from where I'm sitting. Okay. football field or two. That's the reality. And the reason why those Democrats sit where they sit, holding the election certificates they hold, is because we have lost elections. And a big part of the reason why we have lost elections is because we've spent significantly more time and energy going after each other than we have advocating for the values that we hold in common and standing in opposition to the people who don't hold those values and putting people into power who will vote the right way if given that power. And look, I understand the lack of trust and the being fed up and thinking, oh yeah, sure, if we sure Walter, we elect people who say they're going to do the right thing, we give them power, we put them in the majority, well, they're just going to disappoint us because we've seen it before. And you're right, you have seen it before. You saw it under George W. Bush, where he had total control of the federal government. And what they do, they passed Medicare Part D. That's what you got for your trouble. And frankly, this one might scare you up a bit. Under Donald Trump, his first 2 years in office, total control of the federal government. Did we repeal and replace Obamacare? No, sir, we did not. Sure didn't. So we have this kind of generational memory as conservatives of Republicans with power not doing what they said they were going to do, and certainly not doing what we hoped that they would do. But then we settled on this idea that in order to punish them for that, and in order to not pick the lesser of the two evils, we were going to engage in all sorts of behavior and tactics that damn the torpedoes, whether Democrats win or not, we don't care so long as we get rid of all the rhinos. That's the attitude. And there have been times when I've had that attitude. It's the wrong attitude. It's the wrong attitude. It's the attitude that has me here now doing what I'm doing what you want me to do. I voted no on this bonding bill. So I'm with you. But I'm doing it in a context where I have no actual power. And that's why I'd like to turn back to what Eric Mortensen has to say here. He talks about how he goes into the details. This bill did require a supermajority vote in the House. So the Democrats have 70 seats. It requires 81 votes to pass. So they only needed 11 Republican votes. They got 21. And the point that Mortensen makes here is that, using his words, the rhinos pissed that leverage away last night. He says that here. Okay. And that point, the idea behind that is that we could have held out and not passed the bonding bill, and then held it over the heads of the Democrat majority and said, if you want bonding, you're going to give us a Social Security tax cut. And indeed, that is the strategy over on the other chamber in the Senate. That's their plan. We'll see how it turns out. Maybe it works. Maybe it won't. I don't know. To me, that's not the chief. That wasn't the deciding factor in my vote. The deciding factor in my vote was, number one, I was concerned over whether or not the projects that we've worked hard to include in the bill, that are essential projects in communities that we serve and we're elected to, that those projects are going to remain in the bill when they get over to the Senate and the Senate has their way with them without any prearranged agreement between the two chambers, between the two caucuses. And then secondarily, it's very, very early in a session where we have $17.5 billion. So this didn't need to happen now. The interesting thing about Eric Mortensen making this case is that it is precisely the same case that was made by this guy right over here, right there. Now, if you can't see who I'm pointing to, the name is Daudt, Doubt, as in Kurt Doubt. and you scroll over and you see his vote, little old red dot. Kurt Doubt voted no on bonding. And he didn't just vote no on bonding. He took a blowtorch to the very idea of bonding, and he did so on the House floor. And here's some of that.
$2 billion of borrowing and zero tax relief. Zero money for you, Minnesotans. Zero. And those are the people that are paying the higher inflation, the higher gas prices, the high. Have you been to the grocery store lately? Have you tried to refinance your mortgage lately? My taxpayers in my district don't need to pay for a police station in Edina. And they also, as we've already talked about, don't need to pay for the school lunches for kids in Edina. That is not a need in the state of Minnesota. A police station in Edina, Minnesota isn't a need for a taxpayer, a low-income taxpayer in my district. We have more than twice as much money as we've ever had. And somehow we can't find enough money to pay for that. Minnesotans very, very narrowly put Democrats in charge of this state, but they are watching at home. They're watching what you're doing. You made promises to them. You said you were going to exempt their Social Security income. Now the little buzz around the Capitol is that's not going to happen because you can't afford it. You can't afford all the spending that you want to do and still exempt Social Security income. And the proof of that is that we're borrowing $2 billion today.
So here's my question for you, and here's what I want you to consider going forward, okay? As a brotherhood and sisterhood of conservatives and Republicans in the state of Minnesota. If we're going to play this game where we look for our elected officials, the people who we've entrusted to come and represent us here in the legislature and elsewhere, if we're going to play this game where we look for where they've stepped out of line and then we pounce on them and we highlight their names and we sick the dogs on them and we say, get these rhinos out of office, attack them, attack. If we're going to do that, that's fine. You have that prerogative. I'm not telling you you can't do that. You very clearly can, and nobody can stop you. What I am suggesting, though, is that we at the very least be consistent. Kurt Doubt has aside from what I'm saying now and a post I put out on Twitter last week or earlier this week, Kurt Doubt gets no recognition for saying the right thing, doing the right thing, standing up and making the case for conservatism. He gets no credit for that at all because it has been decided that he's one of the bad guys. And when you do that, when you decide that one of our people, he's an elected Republican, like it or not, when you decide that one of our people is a bad guy to the point where you're not going to give him credit for doing the thing that you want them to do, that you want all of us to do, then it creates a culture where your complaints aren't going to be taken as seriously as they should be. And I'm telling you this from firsthand experience of many, many conversations with many, many people within these walls and outside. If you want to be taken seriously as an activist, it can't just be negative flamethrower all the time against the rhinos. There has to be both a carrot and a stick. And there also has to be something else that should be fairly common and apparent and obvious to those of us that run in these conservative Republican circles, because a lot of us call ourselves Christians, and that's grace. You need a little bit of grace. Not a lot. I'm not saying, take people at their word. I'm not saying trust and don't verify. I'm just saying show a little bit of grace, just a tad. And let me define that. Let me tell you exactly how much grace I would like you to show. I would ask you to show. Show enough grace as to not assume the absolute worst about an elected Republican's motives. and why they're doing what they're doing or saying what they're saying. Because you're probably wrong. You're probably wrong. There's context. There's things that are going on in people's communities and people's districts. Varying degrees of urgency with a lot of these projects. I mean, I'll tell you, I'll make it personal for you. All right. You want to give me credit as one of the good guys because I voted no on this? Well, I'll tell you what, I got a project in this bill that just passed. $5 million for a wastewater treatment plant in St. Michael. Now that project is needed. That is a necessary project. If it had come down, if the hypothetical situation had been they needed 11 Republican votes and the board lit up and they only had 10. And I'm sitting there in that moment looking at that board, realizing that if I don't switch my vote from red to green, St. Michael is potentially not going to get its wastewater treatment plant. I would have had a really hard time remaining steadfast in that moment. That is a confession. Now, the argument to keep the light red is that because even now it passed, but just because it passed doesn't mean that project is going to go through. It could die in the Senate. It could be ripped out in the Senate. And again, that's part of the reason why I voted no. But I'm just telling you, there are varying degrees of pressure that is not like it's not leadership pressure. It's not lobbyist pressure. It's not the swamp. It's knowing what's going to happen to actual people in your community, people who you know, people who you care about, go to church with, see at the grocery store, knowing the impact on your community because something it needs, it doesn't get. That's the pressure that informs people to press green instead of red on something like a bonding bill. And you don't have to like that. You don't have to agree with it. You can argue against it. You can condemn the person. I'm not saying don't let your voice be heard. I'm not saying don't make your case. I'm just saying if at the end of the day, we want to have Republicans in a position where we can actually do things differently than they're being done now, then our ultimate objective must be getting Republicans elected. That has to be the number one overriding concern. If it is not, then you are only ever going to get terrible outcomes because we're not going to be in charge. And that's not what I want. I don't think it's what you want. Trying to be honest here. The experiment that I'm running here is, can a politician just be honest? Can a politician just tell you what's going on? Good, bad, and ugly. And it make a positive difference. I hope so. I guess we'll see. Take care.